Hello, dear viewers. As some of you already know, I'm on my way back to Ukraine. Yes, that Ukraine. Naturally, this is going to affect the channel, and for that reason, I wanted to put out at least one new video before leaving. Mainly because my ad revenue has kind of gone through the floor. So I'm warning you up front that this is a little rushed because I'm doing it while simultaneously trying to tie up any loose ends. Another thing I have to explain before we get into this is why I haven't made any serious videos about the situation in Ukraine up to now, despite my experience and background there. So let's begin with that. So I decided to start making videos back in late 2019. I had moved to a new neighborhood and was settling into a new life in America with my wife. I'd successfully submitted a pitch for a book to the military history publisher Osprey and was told it would be discussed at their annual planning meeting that following spring. I was actually building a social circle and doing activities with friends. Can you imagine that? The future looked bright, hopeful. And then, well, yeah, you know what happened. Under the lockdown, there wasn't much to do except paint Warhammer 40k minis and keep doing more YouTube videos. If you look back into my catalog, you'll see that many of those videos are rather crudely produced and somewhat primitive. I was, and still am, learning video production pretty much from scratch. And without a decent camera or other people to work with, one of the easiest things to do is get footage from video games. Same thing with movies. But then you might ask, why video games and movies? Why not Russia and Ukraine, since I lived and worked in both countries for a long time? Well, to make a long story short, I wanted to get away from serious topics and politics on this channel. You have to understand that Russia's war in Ukraine, and I'm talking about the war that began in 2014, as well as Russia's nefarious actions in general, are topics that I have to deal with on a daily basis. Monitoring this stuff is kind of my profession. If you casually follow the news, you may hear a quote from Putin or Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. But have you ever actually listened to any of these people? I mean, at length? Do you know what it's like having to do that for a living? If you want to simulate the effects for yourself, you can always try slamming your head into a hard surface a few times and you'll get the general idea. Basically, much of my daily life for the past 8 years involves monitoring multiple, brutal conflicts, and on a few occasions, I ended up witnessing one of those firsthand. I wanted to get away from that with this channel. I wanted to do something funny and lighthearted. That's one reason I rebranded it using the mascot of a Kiev-based pasta factory. Yeah, that's where Spaghetti Kozak came from, in case you were wondering. As far as online activity goes, I wanted out. I wanted to be a man of peace. But fate, or more accurately, this asshole here, had to ruin everything. Seriously though, when Russia recently escalated its war in Ukraine, it hit me in a way I cannot adequately describe. I would have been there at the time, but my trip was cut short just 2 weeks before things kicked off. And just that fact alone filled me with rage. That night, a sleepless one I might add, I began receiving messages from friends in Kyiv telling me that they have fled their homes. Many of them have not yet returned. Those who aren't refugees are either serving in the military or territorial defense. I can at least say that at the time I wrote this, all of them are still alive and well, alhamdulillah. And so now you see why I haven't made any serious analytical videos about Ukraine or the war, because the fact is, when you have a personal connection to something, it hits differently. Many people unrealistically expect all quality analysis to be totally cold and unbiased, although there's considerable disagreement as to what unbiased means. And while it is important to analyze things from a position of detachment and objectivity, it isn't always possible, nor does it always guarantee the quality of analysis. Now, if you want good analysis from people who are not personally connected to the conflict, I highly recommend videos on this topic from the YouTubers Adam Something and Laserpig. Both have done spectacular work on this topic, and links to their videos are in the description below. With all that finally out of the way, let's get right down to it. Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. So, to understand one of the most perplexing and confusing aspects of this war for outsiders, we need to talk about what happened in the run-up to the full-scale offensive. Since I was in Ukraine in the first half of February this year, I can use my own experience to set the stage. You see, if you followed certain well-recognized Russia and Russian military experts, beginning around autumn 2021 as monitors started noticing the unusual, unexplained military buildup around Ukraine's borders, you'd have noticed a certain doomer tone to it. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking, that these experts were all just propagandists paid by Russia to dissuade the West from helping Ukraine, mainly by painting the situation as hopeless. And yes, there were a few people who probably fit that bill, but the people I have in mind were, and for some inexplicable reason still are, respected sources on Russian military issues. What precisely was the general tenor of their predictions? Obviously, narratives differed, but the main gist was something like this. At H hour, Russia will hit Ukraine with massive cyber attacks and electronic warfare systems. Major cities will be blacked out as utilities are knocked offline by concentrated cyber attacks on infrastructure. The cellular network will be taken down along with the Ukrainian internet. All Ukrainian military comms will be knocked out and military command and control structures will be blinded, if not utterly destroyed by overwhelming air power. The Ukrainian Air Force, including the brand new Bayraktar TB2s, will be destroyed on the ground, knocked out of the fight in the first few hours, and Ukrainian air defense reduced to scrap metal in the same time frame. Russia would have complete mastery of the skies over Ukraine, and all Ukrainian military forces east of the Dnipro River would be encircled and destroyed in a matter of days. Kiev was given 48 hours to hold out under the worst case scenario, maybe a week at best. Oh, and if you think those javelins or NLAWs will help, if you think Ukrainian forces will wage some kind of bloody insurgency in urban areas, think again, because the Russian military is just going to avoid urban areas and use their long-range standoff weaponry to completely pummel them into submission until they surrender. There won't even be a chance for a prolonged insurgency because Russia won't seek to occupy territory long-term. They'll simply move in, neutralize the cities, destroy the Ukrainian military, and then compel a peace treaty on their terms. How could Ukraine's armed forces, bolstered by thousands of near-elderly men and women who barely had enough rifles, ever hope to stand against the mighty Russian war machine? I mean, did you see that Russian army recruitment commercial? So masculine, so hetero. The mighty Russian warriors will utterly devastate the pathetic pronoun armies of the West, let alone Ukraine. Okay, that last bit was a little exaggeration, but getting back to what the actual experts were saying, I must admit I was definitely concerned. I was following analysis put out by people with far more expertise in the field and actual academic credentials. And although I can say that I had a bit more faith in the Ukrainian military and skepticism of Russia's military modernization, it was hard not to take the doomsayers seriously. When I was in Kiev in February, if I got up in the middle of the night for any reason, I'd instinctively check for power, internet, and cell service. On 10th February, it was reported that US intel believed Putin had made the decision to invade, and from that point on, the attack could come at any moment. That was when some of my friends implemented their bug-out plans. A few days later, I left just as some airlines were canceling all flights to Ukraine. All I could do then was sit and watch from an ocean away. And then it happened. But it did not go as most of the experts had predicted. From the very beginning, Russia started to face embarrassing setbacks. The blitzkrieg the experts predicted turned out to be more like Schitzkrieg. Instead of Operation Bagration, Russia launched Operation Bargain Bin Barbarossa. They gambled on dramatic offensives deep into Ukrainian territory, often using elite airborne and Spetsnaz units, many of which found themselves being cut off and destroyed. Russian weapon systems that Russo-boos have been honking off to for decades were showing up as wreckage, or in some cases, they were getting hauled off by Ukrainian farmers with tractors after their crews abandoned them for the slightest reason. Reasons like running out of fuel. Soon, Russian troops would be running out of food as well. Pictures and videos of bewildered Russian prisoners of war, some captured by middle-aged, if not elderly territorial defense members, flooded social media. It was discovered that many Russians had rations that expired years ago. Russia would take nearly a week to capture its first major city, Kherson, and despite that, pro-Ukrainian protests there and in other smaller occupied towns continue to the present. At the time I wrote this, Mariupol was still contested. At this point, the city has been reduced to ruins as the Russian army shelled it ceaselessly in its efforts to protect Russian speakers. And then there's Sumy. Sumy has been an absolute nightmare to Russian forces, and most of the Ukrainian forces operating in and around it are simple territorial defense units. Russia utterly failed to encircle Kiev. They never managed to cut off ways in or out of the city, and at this time Ukrainian forces have not only pushed Russians far back from the capital, but they even appear to have surrounded a large grouping of Russian troops in the area. Now that is not to say that Russia didn't do massive damage in Ukraine, nor is it militarily beaten. Yet. But suffice it to say, this is not going according to plan, no matter what the Kremlin and its Ministry of Defense said. That is, unless they plan to lose as many as 15,000 soldiers, over 1,000 vehicles, and 7 generals in roughly 1 month. Oh, and this ship too. They have suffered the worst Air Force losses since the first Gulf War. In short, this has been one of the most embarrassing military campaigns in modern history, and it's likely to get even worse. Now, to be fair to the experts I referred to earlier, some of them weren't entirely wrong in their predictions. Even so, there are a few experts who probably should consider retirement after this. Like, hey, you had a good run, but it's over now. You don't need to tell your next potential employer about why you left your previous job. Just say something like, I come to Subway all the time and I think it's a really great product. I think I'd be a good addition to the team. Something like that. But seriously, the question remains, why? Why did it go so badly for Russia? Well, here's a point where I feel that knowledge of the culture and society in Putin's Russia actually trumps raw military analysis. You see, there's this Russian word, распиздяйство, and it kind of means sloppiness, absent, or bloody-mindedness, albeit with a slightly more vulgar connotation. In general, it's incompetence, and it tends to be worse in state institutions where authority is absolute and subordinates are treated poorly, which is a very generous way to describe the Russian military. And even before the war, there were subtle clues that the modernized Russian army wasn't quite up to the hype. For example, Russian troops stationed in Belarus had been selling their fuel to locals on the side. Photos emerged of Russian soldiers sleeping in unsanitary conditions, packed like sardines. As the invasion began to flop, we learned a lot more. Prisoners of war claimed that they had been told they were only going on exercises. Worse still, most battalion tactical group commanders appeared to have no prior information about what was going to happen until shortly before the offensive kicked off. Basically, this invasion was planned between Putin and a very narrow circle of subordinates, and thus many people outside that circle, including military commanders, had no idea what they needed to prepare for. This also crosses into the economic side of the conflict as well. While Russia scrambles to respond to the severe, unprecedented sanctions, they fail to adequately prepare for them because, again, the war was planned and decided by a small group around Putin, and thus many people whose job entailed working around sanctions were left out of the loop. And apart from the secrecy, there was the constant outright lying about the intentions behind the military deployments, which came from Russia's leadership and state media. Right up until the day of the invasion, Russian officials put out the line that these deployments were merely for exercises, and that the idea that they were planning some kind of invasion of Ukraine was simply Western warmongering propaganda. No surprise, a lot of folks in the West took up that same mantra. So again, even if you were some Russian government functionary who had an idea of what might happen and who was worried about possible sanctions, you couldn't really take the initiative to do anything about it when everyone around you and above you is insisting that the claims about an impending war are just Western hysteria. Without getting too deep into it, let me just say that Russia isn't a country where you want to be the one guy in the room making a stand. Devil's advocacy looks like dissent, and dissent means disloyalty. One particularly dangerous effect of this is that it makes it much more likely to believe one's own propaganda. In this case, the idea that Ukrainians would greet the Russians with flowers as liberators. And yet still, there are many things going wrong with this war that are simply baffling. In the interwar era, Red Army theorists made massive contributions to modern military thought by developing the idea of operational art, deep battle doctrine, and whatnot. But when they utterly failed to implement that in 1939 and 1941, they had a very good excuse, the purges. In the case of modern Russia, it seems like the problem was just laziness and greed. Now, as always, Russia had a lot of Western Russophiles cheering for it before the war, even if they were all repeating the government line about how the invasion would never happen because it was just Western hysteria. As the war quickly went south for Russia, the coping began. Oh boy, did it.
I've seen.
Cope.
You people wouldn't believe.
Some early excuses sounded something like, bro, these aren't even their best troops. They don't send the best troops in first. Okay, first of all, not sending in your best troops first is incredibly stupid. But here, it doesn't matter because this claim is bullshit. They tried to throw the VDV into Hostomel from the very beginning. They sent Chechens towards Kyiv, and it just got one of their generals killed. Spetsnaz tried to thunder run into Kharkiv, and shortly thereafter they were massacred. But bro, they aren't even using many of their tanks or artillery. Just wait. Yeah, that worked out well, didn't it? Russia's elite 4th Guards tank division took heavy losses after being defeated in Trostyanets, which is located near, you guessed it, Sumy. And the hits just keep coming. Naval infantry, Spetsnaz, VDV, all have taken major losses and suffered setbacks if not outright defeat. Bro, we're only seeing one side of this war. You're only looking at the Russian losses, we're not seeing the Ukrainian ones. To be fair, this argument in principle is sound, if only as a warning to avoid echo chambers. But here's the thing. A lot of times when people say we're only seeing one side of this war, what they really mean is they are only seeing one side of it because they assume everyone has the same access to information as they do, that is, to Western media. For one thing, I follow people who track Ukrainian losses as well, and I've seen strikes on Ukrainian vehicles as well as their results. Here's the thing though, they just don't compare to what the Russian military is suffering.
Значит так, 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 так. Значит так, 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 так. Значит так, 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 так.
Plus, I routinely follow Russian state media to monitor this stuff, and I can tell you that if they were actually achieving as much as they claimed, we never see the end of videos depicting destroyed Ukrainian columns and troops surrendering en masse. Instead of this, however, the Russian government cracked down on media reporting in the first few days of the war. This was followed by a crackdown on social media and a new law against spreading allegedly false information about the military, which carries a maximum penalty of 15 years in prison. Folks, this is not something you do when everything is going according to plan and you're winning. But bro, they're gonna dig in and use mass artillery to besiege cities. This was actually the topic of a video that'll go unnamed, which posited that while Russian forces were stopped outside of Kyiv, they would begin to surround and besiege the city after digging into the current position. You all remember the big convoy, right? As I mentioned before, Russian forces never managed to cut off access into and out of the city, even when they had reached the limit of their advance. Oh, you think Russia will give up just because it lost over 15,000 soldiers? Have you ever heard of a little thing called the Second World War? Yeah, so the thing about this idiotic argument is that, first of all, in World War II, it was the Soviet Union, not just Russia. It was attacked by an enemy whose stated objective was the extermination and/or sterilization and enslavement of the entire population west of the Ural Mountains. The invaders began implementing this plan virtually from the earliest days of the invasion. Ergo, it became painfully clear to a lot of people very quickly that, as repressive as it was, the Soviet Union was actually preferable to a regime that came in to do nothing but destroy them. It was purely a matter of survival. And on that note, one should remember that the Soviet Union had millions of Ukrainians and Belarusians fighting for it, along with its many other nationalities. Russia doesn't have that kind of manpower. The overwhelming majority of Russians do support or claim to support Putin's war, but this is passive support. They're not storming the local military commissariats to sign contracts to go fight in Ukraine. But bro, trust me, look at this map whose source I didn't check out. Ukrainian forces in Donbass are cut off. The cauldron will close any day now. Sure, there are parts of Donbass in danger of being cut off. But for the most part, closing any cauldrons whatsoever has proved exceedingly difficult for Russian forces, and their strength only diminishes each day, especially due to the Russian military's horrendous deficiencies in one of the most critical aspects of modern warfare, logistics. But so far, supply lines remain open to the bulk of Ukrainian forces, which benefit from something known as interior lines. And some areas like Sumy, which were facing encirclement, are no longer totally surrounded. Worse still for the Russians, recently in Sumy they resorted to using men conscripted from the local population in Russian-controlled Donetsk Oblast. And to put it mildly, these troops are not particularly enthusiastic. Okay, well, Putin actually never intended to take Kyiv. It was always about Donbass. The Kyiv thing was a feint. This has become the popular refrain ever since Russia claimed to be drawing down forces outside of Kyiv. In reality, those forces have been repelled by the Ukrainian military, and the claim that this was a feint just doesn't add up, especially when you look at how much Russia committed along this axis. They were beaten, pure and simple. It's fairly clear that the Russian military hasn't collapsed, and they can still do a lot of harm, especially to civilians. But here's the thing, Russo-boo, Russia's not winning this war, not by a long shot, especially not politically. The only way Ukraine loses this is if spineless leaders in the West start pressuring Zelensky for peace while threatening to withhold military aid. They've already proven utterly craven when it comes to providing Ukraine with some of the materials asked for, such as MiG-29s or long-range surface-to-air missile systems. Contact your senators, representatives, members of parliament. But even then, all it means is that Ukraine's war will shift into some kind of prolonged insurgency. It'll be bloody, it'll be painful, and it'll be gruesome. But Ukrainians are not going back to Russian rule, especially now, when the consequences of that rule have been made very clear by the Russian military. And when the people who lived under Russian occupation in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast get tired of being used as cannon fodder and props to justify the war, then Russia would have an even bigger problem on its hands. But absent some kind of scenario like what I've just outlined here, Russia will continue to suffer defeats, its military reduced to taking out its frustration on the civilian population. So now we're left with the question of why? Why did it turn out this way? And the answer could be seen in the opening days of the war. It is very clear, both from the words of Putin as well as the behavior of his military, that they did not expect Ukraine to fight. They literally believe that Ukraine is a fake country and Ukrainians are really just Russians who have been led astray by dastardly Western Ukrainians, who in turn are in the pay of Western masters. Russians will tell you that Ukrainians as a people were invented by the Poles to divide Russia. Then they were invented by Austria-Hungary. No, wait, they were invented by Vladimir Lenin. It's all nonsense, but they really came to believe it. And they thought if they just made a lot of noise in the beginning, the government would collapse. They were sure many Ukrainians would support them, because they all really want to be Russians. So why take out all that infrastructure if you expect to have a pro-Russian puppet in power within a few weeks, right? And why bother with complex tasks like suppression of enemy air defenses or the Air Force if you're just going to decapitate the government in the first few days? Just throw some of those fancy Iskanders or Kalibrs at it, and the Ukrainian Air Force will stay grounded. And yet all this time the Ukrainian Air Force continues to operate, as does the air defense. Yes, that's right. In over a month, Russia has not achieved air superiority. And remember all that stuff about cellular networks and internet going down? Yeah, were that the case, we wouldn't be watching the utter humiliation of Russia's military unfolding before our very eyes. And as for the internet, well, the Ukrainian internet is so resilient that even I've been using it from time to time for research. The fact is that although Russia's not defeated, and they can probably sustain this for an extended period if they so wish, they're not going to achieve anything beyond more war crimes, death, and destruction. They've destroyed their economy over this ridiculous venture, and there's simply no secret strategy they're going to pull out of their asses to reverse any of that. They've embarrassed themselves in the face of their ever-dwindling list of allies and potential allies. There simply is no truly winning end state for them. Putin fucked around for roughly 2 decades, and now he's reached the all-critical finding out phase. How does this end? I can't tell you for sure. Hell, I might not even live to see the end of it. A few years ago, I just wanted to create an entertainment channel mostly dedicated to the video games and movies of my youth, and then this goofy-looking jackass had to go and start the largest war in Europe since the 1990s, and it's happening in a country that's very near and dear to me. What I can say for sure is that the world is going to be a very different place after this. How different and how much better it gets will depend on a number of factors. The most important one being how utterly humiliated Russia ends up being. And anyone can play a role in bringing that to fruition, because Ukraine's struggle is an internationalist struggle. Truth be told, there really aren't many black and white conflicts in history, but every once in a while, you get one that comes close, and this is one of those. So make sure you're standing on the right side. Let's see this one through. Slava Ukraini. Alright, well folks, I realize I was a little bit rushed. Maybe it was a little bit more dramatic than most things on this channel. I want to thank you for bearing with me and watching this. I'm headed off to Ukraine, so I really appreciate your support. There's a Patreon link down in the description to this video. Like, share, subscribe, especially share. And also check me out on Twitter, @SpaghettiCozak. So once again, thanks for watching, and stay tuned.